Four Spheres of Knowledge Creation. The Causal Principles by René Holmbjerg Bøtker. Chapter 15. Tacit and Explicit Knowledge. Schopenhauer argued that there are two faculties of the human mind which allow us to apprehend the world around us. The Verstand, or understanding, is the faculty that allows us to understand causality as a representation of the world as it really is. The Vernunft, or reasoning, is the faculty that gives us the ability to conceptually relate things to other things as a human construct. Understanding will lead to truth. Reasoning will lead to illusions. Schopenhauer thought the primary duty of the Verstand was to understand causality in events unfolding as preconceptual knowledge. Subjecting understanding to conceptual analysis would be a matter of reasoning and lead to illusions. The only way to understand causality was to understand it through the powers that enabled the events to happen. These powers, although present, were to Schopenhauer outside of the phenomenal world of objects, in space and time, and therefore outside the reach of human perception. Schopenhauer argued that the powers that enable causality were representations of the noumenal property of the objects in the event. As the noumenal world is undifferentiated, Schopenhauer believed that we would be able to gain an insight into causality by understanding the noumenal properties of one single object, as the properties of any other objects would present the same causality. Since there is only one object through which we can gain insight into its noumenal properties, this object is central to the thesis of Schopenhauer. The object in question is the body of the individual who is seeking insight. Schopenhauer argues that any conceptual knowledge is bound to the phenomenal world, and insight into causality is indescribable through language, but expressible in space as phenomenal representation. The ability of the artist is to engage in introspection and spatially express his or her insight into causality. The artist expresses a both momentary and eternal insight into the world, as it truly noumenally is. What Schopenhauer argues here is that the tacit, explicit taxonomy is inherently connected to interactions between objects. Projecting this thought onto the ontological basis presented earlier, we see that Schopenhauer is arguing that the artist represents expressive interactions in the spatial dimension. He connects this type of knowledge with tacit knowledge by arguing that it is a representation of noumenal, undifferentiated property, and therefore not subject to the language of denotation that we use to represent the phenomenal differentiated property of an object. The tacit, explicit taxonomy therefore concerns our ability to represent the interaction between objects. Interactions as tacit and explicit knowledge. Tacit and explicit knowledge concerns the interaction between objects, which takes place in either the spatial or the temporal dimension. The interaction between objects is an exchange of property between interacting objects. The property of an object is infinite and undifferentiated until the object engages in the actualization process as a phenomenal representation. Through its property, an object already contains all possibilities for interaction. In the actualization process, an immaterial exchange of property occurs between two objects. This exchange happens through the expression of property from one object and the perception of property from another object. Interaction is twofold and exists in the form of either expressive interaction or perceptive interaction. Depending on whether the interaction takes place in the spatial or temporal dimension, the form of interaction, as expressive or perceptive, determines the absorptive and creative capacity of knowledge in relation to the definition of the object. Tacit and explicit knowledge concerns the definition of an object through the representation of property in interactions. Tacit knowledge is not subject to definition through a language of denotation, whereas explicit knowledge is subject to definition through a language of denotation. A language of denotation is denoting states of affairs, which consists of facts regarding objects interacting in space or time. The astute will notice that, logically, there are only 4 words in a true language of denotation, which are this, that, these, and those. Furthermore, they only exist in the spatial dimension. However, as this insight wasn't prevalent until the early 20th century, and for the purpose of understanding and practicality, the language of denotation, which is used here, incorporates conceptually denoted objects in both the spatial and temporal dimension. Thereby, the entire array of denotative words can be included and applied in both the spatial and temporal dimension. Interactions between objects takes place as an exchange of property between objects in either the spatial or temporal dimension. The property enables us to define the object by its interaction as either an expressive or perceptive interacting object. The definition of an object is a function of its property as an interacting expressive or perceptive object in either the spatial or temporal dimension. The taxonomy of knowledge, as well as the capacity to absorb and create knowledge, is determined through this function. The definition of an object represents the property of an object, and it is through interaction that the property of an object can be defined. Interaction is not only a process where property is exchanged. It is also a process of actualization wherein objects are differentiated from each other. Objects exists as potential objects before the actualization process, and it is not possible to define an object through property, which is not inherently existing. Knowledge consists of either expressive or perceptive content and cannot contain both expressive and perceptive content. Expressive content represents the property of the expressing object. Perceptive content represents the property of the perceiving object. Spatial and temporal interaction. The spatial dimension refers to a single, instantaneous representation of multiple objects. A spatial object is differentiated from other objects through the boundaries that the objects share. The interaction between objects defines the objects in space and differentiates an object from other objects through definition of property. Definition in space differentiates an object from other objects by presenting the alignment of phenomenal representation of noumenal property, which becomes apparent in the interaction between objects. The alignment of property is an alignment of recognition, where a perceiving object attempts to recognize the property of an expressing object in its own property. The foundation of space has an expressive character, as the expressing object represents its own property as the founding property of space. The temporal dimension refers to a sequence of multiple representations of a single object. A temporal object is differentiated through the boundaries that an object shares with other representations of itself. The interaction between multiple representations of an object defines the object in time and differentiates an object from representations of itself through definition of property. The temporal representations exist only as perceptive recognitions through multiple interactions with the expressing object. The temporal dimension presents definition as an alignment of recognition. The alignment of recognition exists between the property of one perceived object and the property of another perceived representation of that object as two sequential interacting representations of one and the same object. The recognized perceived property is the foundation of the temporal dimension. The foundation of time has a perceptive character as the expressed object exists temporally as multiple representations of its perceived recognized property as the founding property of time. Spatial expressions. Spatial tacit knowledge refers to spatial interaction, which is not subject to representation through a denotative language. Spatial interaction consists of multiple objects exchanging property through the actualization process, where an expressing object is interacting with a perceiving object. The exchange of property is immaterial and takes place as a process of recognition. This process of recognition in the spatial dimension happens when a perceiving object attempts to recognize the property of an expressing object in its own property. As the recognition takes place in the perceiving object, the expressing object becomes a particular entity as a recognized object. As such, the noumenal property of the expressing object does not exist as a phenomenally actualized object without perception. It exists phenomenally as a recognized entity of perception. Expressive interaction is an immediate representation of the noumenal property of the expressing object, which is not subject to representation through a language of denotation. It exists as an infinite noumenal potential object with noumenal property subject to the possibility of perception through the pre-established harmony, which facilitates the possibility of interaction through shared boundaries. As such, it can interact with all other potential objects. As an expressing spatial entity, it can be recognized in interaction with all other perceiving objects immediately. This is because the infinite noumenal property of the expression exists innately in all other objects as it exists in the pre-established harmony. Spatial perceptions. Spatial explicit knowledge refers to spatial interaction, which is subject to representation through a denotative language. Spatial interaction consists of multiple objects exchanging property through the actualization process, where an expressing object is interacting with a perceiving object. The exchange of property is immaterial and takes place as a process of recognition. This process of recognition in the spatial dimension happens as a result of a perceiving object attempting to recognize the property of an expressing object in its own property. The process of interaction is a process of actualization, where both potential noumenal objects are actualized as phenomenal objects. The recognition takes place in the perceiving object, where the expressing object becomes a particular entity as a recognized object in the phenomenal universe of the perceiving object. As such, the expressing object does not exist as a phenomenal actualized object in its own right. It exists merely as a recognized entity of perception. This recognized entity forms the foundation of spatial explicit knowledge. Perceptive interaction is the foundation of spatial explicit knowledge, where objects exist as a phenomenal representation of the expression, which is recognized by the perceiving object. This makes the perceptive interaction subject to a language of denotation, as the objects are defined as finite differentiated phenomenal objects. The finite representation of spatial explicit knowledge makes any other recognition subject to the same recognition as the perceiving object. As the knowledge is spatially perceived, it can only be acquired as a recognition and not be represented innately. Furthermore, as any representation of perceived spatial knowledge is mediated through the recognition of the perceiving object that took place in the actualization process, any further interactions can only take place if another object has the same ability of recognition as the perceiving object, i.e., any object has to recognize the property of the expressing object as the property existing in the recognition of the perceiving object in order to interact with the actualized object that exists as a perceived entity. Temporal expressions. Temporal tacit knowledge refers to temporal interactions, which are not subject to representation through a denotative language. Temporal interaction consists of multiple representations of a single object, where a single object was exchanging property through the actualization process with other representations of itself. The exchange of property is immaterial and takes place as a process of recognition. This process of recognition in the temporal dimension happens as a result of a perceiving object attempting to recognize the property of itself as a previously expressed representation in its own property. The representations exist as perceptions of expressions in the property of the perceiving object. The expressive interactions are particular differentiated phenomenal representations projected through the particular differentiated phenomenal property of the perceiving object. This presents the temporal expressive interactions as a phenomenal representation which is mediated through the perceiving object. Any other object must therefore express the same property as the perceiving object in order to absorb the knowledge, which is also why any creation is acquired through the perceiving object. Although expressive interactions begin as perceptions and therefore are subject to a language of denotation, the projections of property from the perceiving object onto the expressing object adds the connotations that the perceiving object brings to the denotative language. Thus, expressive interactions are not subject to a language of denotation, but instead it is subject to a language of connotation. Temporal perceptions. Temporal explicit knowledge refers to temporal interactions, which is subject to representation through a denotative language. Temporal interaction consists of multiple representation of a single object, where a single object is exchanging property through the actualization process with other representations of itself. The exchange of property is immaterial and takes place as a process of recognition. This process of recognition in the temporal dimension happens as a result of a perceiving object attempting to recognize the property of itself as a previously expressed representation in its own property. The representations exist as perceptions of expressions in the property of the perceiving object. The perceptive interactions are analog phenomenal representations of the noumenal property of the perceiving object, which enables the temporal dimension as a phenomenal representation of perceived noumenal property. The foundation of the temporal dimension is perceptive interactions. The perceptive interactions are analog phenomenal representations of the noumenal property of the perceiving object. The perceptions in the temporal dimension are phenomenal and therefore subject to a denotative language. Temporal explicit knowledge is a representation of perceptive interaction in the temporal dimension. As this knowledge is an analog phenomenal representation of innate noumenal property, it is immediate given the absolute nature of being an analog phenomenal representation of a noumenal undifferentiated infinite entity.